coming up tonight, it's a tale of magic and mystery, fantasy and fun as we dive into the successful story that spawned the global franchise The Witcher. Up for debate tonight, the book club reads The Last Wish. This is Up for Debate, episode number 116, recorded June 14th, 2018. We read The Last Wish. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of Up for Debate, the debate podcast where the two hosts agree on everything. I'm Sean Jennings, joined as always by our own supernatural hunter man, Mr. Matt Mariani. Hello, Matt.
Hello, Sean. How's it going tonight?
What's the last mythical monster that you killed for money, Matt?
I was quite fond of there's a good old fashioned griffin.
Interesting.
Yeah,
but they're not. Are they usually like monsters? You know what I mean? They're not usually portrayed as being bad, are they?
I think you'll find. I mean, after reading this book, and if you've read, any of our listeners out there have read any of the other books or played the games along with that it fit into this franchise, you'll find quite often that the monsters are actually within our own selves.
Wow, deep stuff. Deep stuff. Well, Matt, you're absolutely right. We're doing another book club episode here, which is always a lot of fun when we do it on the show. If people are interested, you should go back in the archives at upfordebate.tv. Check out some of the other book club episodes we did. We've read Ready Player One, Console Wars was great, Devil in the White City was excellent. Don't read Of Dice and Men, but do listen to the episode because it's a fun episode, even though the book sucked. And now we are doing what I guess is our fifth book, right?
I believe so, yeah.
Excellent. And Matt, you suggested this one. The Last Wish, written by... Do you know how to pronounce his name?
I believe it's Andrzej Sapkowski.
Yes, a Polish author.
Yes, but yeah.
The book originally written in Polish and then translated to English. Matt, why? Why did we read this book this week?
We read this book because I read this book probably about a month ago, and I really liked it. And we haven't done a fantasy book yet in our book talks, and I know that from our own private conversations, we often try to we talk about diversifying our genres with the books that we read, and we try to be consistent with that and make sure that it's not going to be books that are in the same genre every time we do one of these. So I know that if we were going to venture out into the fantasy realm, when we do these book talks, it would have to be a book that would have to be a particular kind of fantasy book to get you on board, because I know that it's not just any fantasy book would do. So I wanted to make sure it was a really good one, and this is the only one I read that I think we could have a really good, lengthy, solid discussion on.
Well, for the fans' sake, I hope so. No, Matt, I'll say, and thank you for that consideration. I've made it clear historically I'm not a fan of fantasy books.
I was trying to put that lightly, but yeah.
Yeah, I don't care for them. And Matt, I'm going to read you a couple things. So I took my usual lengthy notes as I read the book, some things I wrote down. The reason I like nonfiction is because it's set in a world I understand. That was one note. I also wrote, let's see. I took a lot of notes, so I got to scroll through them. Fantasy books are written like Shakespeare. Cool premises, but completely unreadable. And I just generally struggle with fantasy books. But Matt, I teased this to you before we got on the air. I learned something about this book after we read it that helped it make a lot more sense to me. Because one thing I wrote is this what fantasy books are? A bunch of stuff just happens. Where's the narrative arc? And then I wrote later on somewhere in here where I said, why are we getting to Yennefer's backstory on page 272 of the book? Like, the pacing of this book was baffling to me. But then, Matt, I learned something that you did not divulge to me before we read it. This is not a novel. This is a collection of short stories.
Now, I definitely believe, and anybody can go back and check that. I guess we didn't record it, but I definitely think I told you that this.
Nope.
I never told you this at any point?
Nope.
Really?
I feel relatively confident. And if you did, I certainly didn't hear it. So, It was and I was reading through it and I'm like all these little stories are great, but they don't connect to each other. What is going
No,
on?
it's
It was so
that
confusing.
this book. So the backstory with this book is that Andrei Sapkowski uh, wanted to write. I think he wanted to write books or graphic novels, some kind of medium that where he would be able to tell the stories that he heard as a kid growing up in Poland. Now the Poland that he grew up in was troubled by the Cold War. It was troubled by the Soviet occupation, and so the stories, the culture of of Poland was kind of preserved in their storytelling. So for years he grew up hearing these fantastical tales of mythical creatures, of folk legends, and he wanted to create a world where all of those things come to life. So the first thing he did was he just wrote a collection of short stories in the early 90s, after the fall of the Soviet Union, that kind of enculturated his stories that he grew up listening to. And that this book was the fruit of that project. It got very popular, particularly in Europe, all over Europe, and it was considered one of the first major works to come out of a former Soviet bloc that reached kind of popular renown around the continent. So he decided to write a second book, and I will forewarn you that the second book is also a collection of short stories.
Yeah, that's what Wikipedia told me.
It's kind of like a split anthology in a way. And then the story arc actually begins with the book that I'm reading now, which is called The Blood of Elves, and that's where the actual story picks up. So who knows? Maybe in a future episode we'll be going ahead and reviewing that book. But I really thought I warned you of this. This is not really. It's not something I told you.
I mean, I'm going to say it's probably more likely that you did tell me and I just forgot.
Okay.
That seems highly likely. Either way, I did not know that.
Because I don't know. I'm pretty good about taking responsibility for stuff like that.
And I'm taking responsibility that I forgot. I probably forgot.
I don't know, but
it's more fun to review that you did it, but I probably forgot.
Yeah.
So
this must have been very confusing for you as you were reading this book.
It was, because the narrative part is like 2 pages and then it jumps into like an unrelated event, and I couldn't wrap. And then for a while I was like, is this because it was translated out of Polish that it doesn't make any sense? And I'm like, no, that's not quite it. And then, like I mentioned, I know a little bit about the video games, and one of the few things I know is that Yennefer is a major character in the video games and the book. And so when we got to literally 2/3 of the way through the book until we get to her character, I'm like, what is going on? Like, there's no character development. So maybe we should mention to people, because I know sometimes people listen to this, but they haven't read the book. Might be good to give them a brief overview of the story. The last wish here, following the main character. I'm going to mispronounce everyone's names because they're fantasy names, but Geralt of Rivia, who is
Geralt.
That's what I said.
Geralt.
Geralt, who is a Witcher, Matt. A Witcher, that's where the name came from. A person who is trained from a young age to battle deadly beasts through the help of training and body modification to essentially be a monster hunter for hire. And he goes around and whoops some ass on some monsters throughout the story. And as we've talked about, it is a series of short stories. So how many would you say are in here? Maybe like 6?
Altogether, it's kind of hard to tell because there is actually one story that is
super
kind of
loose narrative,
throughout.
like crazy loose.
There's definitely like him talking to the nuns at the monastery, the priestesses.
Yes,
like that's kind of, and then what happens at the end. That's kind of like one long story that these other stories are kind of are kind of like mixing in
But
and out of.
they're all told as essentially flashbacks, one would say.
Yes, yeah, I would say so. And it's very. I enjoyed the way that it was done, the way that it was presented. It's like, the nun will mention something, and then he'll be like, you can really see like the gears turning in Geralt's mind, where he's like, oh, that reminds me of this, and then every story is kind of like a tangent, basically. It's just a long tangent that Geralt remembering something, or Geralt telling the one of the other characters that he's talking to about.
Yeah, I struggled with the format, partly because I didn't know what the format was, but also because, to be fair, we talked a lot in these book club episodes about go one way or the other, right? Don't split the difference. And we said that with a lot of the books we've read. And I kind of felt this way, where it's like, either be a short story book and just say a bunch of short stories, because while the narrative thread at the monastery, whatever, was somewhat interesting, it didn't really add anything to the short stories. It really just sort of set a stage we never got to see, which is partly what was frustrating, where it's like you're setting something up and we spend a few pages and we never get there. So I kind of wish the book had either just been short stories or had actually told a narrative story. Like, I struggled, and I think it would have been easier had I known what I was getting into, but I still, even knowing now what I know, really would have preferred they picked one way or the other, because the monastery bits just did not do much for me.
Yeah, part of that, it seems like, I don't know, it seems like all of the backstory with Geralt, it seems that it's, I don't know, I don't want to say biased, but I mean, everything is told from Geralt's point of view, right?
Oh, sure.
So, I mean, I don't want to say like, unreliable narrator, but I just from reading the third book, as much as I've read of the third book, and there's an interesting contrast between events that happen and the way that events are told through these tangents in this book than, in Blood of Elves, where things are happening and the characters are reacting to them. It's much more of a third person retelling of events. So you must have been really confused then when you get to like almost 3/4 of the way of done with the book, and Geralt still hasn't left that monastery temple place, right? Like,
yeah,
you had to be wondering, like, well, why is he still here? What, shouldn't he be out adventuring instead of just talking this whole time?
It literally took me, I think, 3 of the short stories to realize that was the format. Because then I'm like, but wait, the first one really didn't have anything to do with the second one. And I'm like, but wait, there's a third one? Like, the characters never cross over. It was very confusing.
That is another thing, is that you definitely don't see any crossover. However, what I like about this, what I think is a positive for the format, is that it presents all of the characters here, so they don't have to spend any time in the third book,
True,
reintroducing them.
Well,
it could be like one sentence or 2 sentences.
I think this book could be strongly improved by just beefing up the arcing narrative just a bit. Like, just give me a little bit, cut out 1 or 2 of the stories, put it in another book, but just beef up that narrative, where either do a better job of connecting the short stories into the narrative piece, or bring back some of the characters. I don't know what it was missing, but it's just, they felt very disconnected. It felt very abrupt as I was reading it. But that doesn't mean I didn't like it, but it just was not a format I was used to reading.
Sure.
But now, Matt, one thing I do want to say, okay, because I got to talk about fantasy books for a second, okay? I've mentioned my general dislike of them. And one of the things that really frustrated, I wrote somewhere in my notes, this book needed about 30% less fantasy. It was just a little too much fantasy. And the one thing I can't stand with these types of books is the way they are written in respect to way too much detail on shit. Like, there must have been, I was so tempted to go back and count every time there was a character who was named. There had to be over 100 characters named in this book. Every paragraph was like, yes, I've visited the inn at Windle Farm, and there King so-and-so from the region of this, and the prince of that ran into the festival of this. And then, like, these paragraphs where they would list, like, 20 things, and then they'd never mention them again. And I'm like, why?
Well, see, that's the lore of the world.
But it's
how
so
you get to
detailed, though. That's what I'm saying. Like, I'm never gonna fucking remember. Who remembers this? I'm on like in book 8, and I'm like, oh my god, that's the one king he mentioned in that paragraph in book 1.
It's kind of like where, you know, to get yourself immersed in the story, right? So if they left all those details out, you know, what kind of a world would your main characters be in? They would just be in a regular, they could just be here. They could be in Massachusetts. They could be in Virginia. When you add the backstory and the lore, like, they are in a living, breathing world that comes to life and has its own history. It has its own culture, its own society. What I really like, I think the book that did it the best that I've ever seen with the backstory, well, obviously the Lord of the Rings. If you're going to go for fantasy, you're going to Lord of the Rings. But the Game of Thrones books, A Song of Ice and Fire, that series has been awesome for that. The lore, where with Lord of the Rings is much more high fantasy. It's much more, you know, elves and dwarves and stuff like that. But the world of A Song in Ice and Fire, those books you could totally have imagined a parallel world where dragons and ice creatures live, but with all of these things happening, with all this backstory and different societies and states forming, you could very easily picture it here. And I genuinely think that The Witcher has much of the same traits. I think both George R.R. Martin and Andrei Sapkowski subscribe to that school of you take the Middle Ages of our world and you just kind of apply fantastical elements to it, rather than reimagining and re-envisioning a fictitious fantasy world. It's got a lot of influences to it. I mean, the role of The Witcher. If you look at the role of The Witcher, I wrote in my notes that he is half knight, half magician, and maybe like a sprinkling of bounty hunter in there. Maybe more than a sprinkling. Maybe it's more like a thirds of each one. But I mean, he really does fulfill the role of a medieval knight when you think about it. However, the contrast is that he is whereas middle-aged knights in the Middle Ages were generally respected and renowned by society, he is very much looked down upon and scorned for the work that he does, despite the fact that he is keeping people safe and protecting them. So it's all about taking the elements in this world that are on the border or on the boundary of the fantastical and just kind of pushing them over the edge into fantastical.
Well, and I agree with you, and I really do want to dig into The Witcher specifically as a character type, but I agree with you, and I think you do want to take relatable themes. One thing I wrote down, a theme I really, really enjoyed in the book, was the idea that a man who trains all his life for a job that might no longer be there. And like, to me, that was a really fascinating, and I like that part of the book. What I'm saying is, don't take it so far with the fantasy aspect. Like, focus on the human story and not these unnecessary details. You kind of said, well, that's how it's like in the real world. I don't go around saying, this is my friend Matt of the House Mariani. His father is named this, and his mother is named this, and he's from this town, and his next door neighbor was this guy. And then it's like, it's just such a weird way to add all of this detail. And I get the idea of world building, but I have a limit, okay? And this book for me cross that, because I just think they really took it too far in some respects.
See, for a fantasy book, I thought they were pretty light
But
on
that's
that.
why I don't. But that's why, honestly, when you suggest this book, I'm like, this seems like quote unquote light fantasy. Put that in quotations. This once again reminded me why you will never get me to read hardcore fantasy books, because it's just not going to fucking happen. I will make that very clear, because
Yeah, this is pretty light if you're going to go into fantasy. I mean,
can't do it.
I don't think the backstory is kind of, I found it to be very unobtrusive. There are fantasy books that I have read where they do nothing but expound on the world for pages and pages, and like they devote entire, like the first half of the chapter will be describing the state of Redvania and like, you know, who the king is and who his son is and their policies and how they've affected the world. And I find that really interesting. That's where we definitely differ as readers. I could read that and just really kind of put myself in that world and breathe it in and kind of imagine the effects of you know certain policies and aspects of that society. But it sounds to me like you just view that as a giant waste of time.
You just streamline it. That's all. It just clogs up the book. Just streamline it. And you know, that's one of the things I have about all of these fantasy worlds. Like, seem super similar, and I kind of, you know, they're all that D&D type, you know, fantasy world, and I get that. But like, as I'm reading this, I'm like, you know what would make a really cool story? This in a more modern setting. Because and I know this is a me preference. I just am not a fan of that sort of Middle Ages-esque fantasy settings, but, you know, the medieval type. But I'm like, this idea of a world invaded by magic and creatures. They create a quote-unquote weapon, a man, a witcher, to fight, trained from a young age in a world that may no longer need them, a world that's changing. You've got this interesting character who, as you mentioned, is for hire. Hard to call him a hero, but really the book wants you to make him out to be a hero, which I think in some respects is okay. An interesting guy, a quippy guy. I was reading this, especially being short stories. I was like, this would make a really good video game. I totally get it. Like, makes a lot of sense. A movie, a TV show. I totally get this is a really intriguing character. I just didn't care for the fantasy aspect of it. That was where you lost me. So I liked the book. Well, let me rephrase that because we're not going to get to the end yet. I liked the character. I liked the arc in the short stories, at least. I just struggled with the fantasy aspect. If that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, and you know, it all comes down to preference for sure. I mean,
sure. No, and I will say, I think you're absolutely right in saying for a fantasy book, I think this was relatively well done. I didn't think it was overwhelming for a fantasy fan. I certainly thought that the individual stories were quite good. I had some I liked more than others, and maybe we can get into that now if there were any particular ones you wanted to mention. But I did think there was value added to the short story aspect of this book because we got to see a lot of different aspects of the character in different situations, meet different characters. I don't know. Were there any of the short stories in particular you really liked or perhaps didn't care for?
I'm trying to remember now. The story that I liked the best, but I also found at the same time the most flawed because it didn't really go anywhere.
Yep.
Was the story where Geralt meets the monster guy, the guy who was transformed into he had like the head of a giant bear or something.
Mm-hmm.
Remember, he like stumbles on the what he thinks is like an abandoned mansion, and he's walking through and he meets this guy, and the guy is like really mean to him at first, but then he kind of befriends him. And then the guy talks about how he is basically cursed, but he managed to kind of twist it to his advantage because he now has the local farmers are bringing him their daughters to kind of appease him, I think, and keep it like so that he won't attack them or attack their village or something like that. I thought that was a great story, but it didn't really seem to go anywhere. Like how did that story conclude? I don't really remember if it did. I think Geralt just kind of leaves, right?
No, he during the fight. So that story in the book called A Grain of Truth, I called it Beauty and the Beast because that's basically what it was. During the fight, the monster character, I'm not going to bother doing names because I can't really pronounce them well, impales the bat creature on a pole so Geralt can finish it off. But before he finishes off the creature, the female creature confesses her love for the monster character, which breaks the curse. But then it kind of just ends. It doesn't really say if they kind of fall in love or.
That's what I mean. Yeah,
there's not a ton of resolution.
Didn't seem like much resolution, but I found that was a really interesting story because it kind of did explore the idea of what is a monster, and like you said, very very Beauty and the Beast and Disney-esque, but done in a nice different way.
I thought the male monster creature Nivellen was well written. I thought he was well written in this vignette. Because I thought it was compelling, telling his backstory, and of course he lived in the fantasy mansion where anything he imagined sort of appeared, and I just think it created an interesting visual of this just normal, somewhat man with this horrific appearance. I agree. I agree. This was probably one of my favorite in the book, despite its lack of compelling ending. Yeah.
Another story I enjoyed was the first story that Geralt tells. It's
the Voice of Reason with the Striga.
Yes, A Voice of Reason. The Striga. Yeah, Striga. I don't know how to pronounce it, but
we're gonna get a lot of stuff wrong tonight.
The Striga is the daughter of the king, and that's not really a spoiler. You know that in the very beginning.
Yeah.
And the king commissions Geralt to break the curse, to try to do anything he can, providing that he does not kill her. Right? The king does not want the daughter to die.
Mm-hmm.
So Geralt uses his Witcher. I think this is really I like this story because it's the first time you see Geralt using his Witcher abilities and his Witcher skills and like just all around, not just with the physicality and the dexterity, but also with deception. Like he's able to deceive the Striga into coming out of the coffin. Do you remember how that one ends? How that one's concluded?
Luckily, the Wikipedia is very detailed. If you don't want to buy the book, read the Wikipedia. Let's see. He kills it successfully. Damn it. I shouldn't be scanning this while we're doing the show, but
yeah, he kills the Striga, and I believe that I just remember it's like very thankless.
Well, yeah,
right?
he gets cut very aggressively on the throat. And he survives.
I just remember him. He does basically everything he can in his power to not kill it. Like
Correct.
He's tried pretty much everything, and he really doesn't have much of a choice.
He does return the monster to an ordinary little girl, who's a little slow because she's been a monster for all of her life, but at the last second cuts him, so she survives as the curse is broken. So he essentially wins at the end, but he is badly hurt.
So he gets his reward, and then he's just he's very much just dismissed and sent on his way.
Yep.
And that's really the recurring theme in all of these books, and not just the books, but also the video game as well. Is just that being a Witcher is a very thankless job. You're compensated in coin, and that's about it. You're just kind of constantly told to get on your way, to get out of there, to just leave. These are men and women that are not considered heroes by any stretch, or if they are, they're not really given a hero's welcome or hero's embrace by anybody in this world.
Yeah.
But I want to touch on something that you brought up that I really liked, and it made me remember so I read this book on my Kindle, and the one section of the book, sometimes I'll go through, and usually with nonfiction I'll highlight things and notes to to go back and read it again. I think the only thing that I found worth highlighting in this book was the quote from, I think it's one of the peasants or something that Geralt encounters on his way, and he says, "Do you know what? Do you know what is? Do you know what? Why I would never be a Witcher, or what I would never? Why the reason I'd never be a Witcher is every time you do your job, and kill a monster, that's one less monster in the world, and this world this is a world that is already seeing fewer and fewer monsters, and basically it's a it's a job that is eliminating itself, right?
Well, they have the great couple of mini sentences in there where they talk about the bridge troll that is terrible, but they end up paying him because it's cheaper because the troll maintains the bridge, and there's the sort of one of the last dragon type creatures, but a king or a count's daughter has become so enthralled with it, no one can kill it because it's essentially a pet at this point. And I thought those were really sort of poignant stories of a world adapting and changing to meet these challenges that have befallen it. And I really appreciated those moments.
Sure. Yeah, like the there might be evil spirits in this graveyard, but the evil spirits are keeping the grave robbers away. So that people's tombs don't get robbed, and things like that. It really does tell you the story of a society that has learned to adapt. And I wonder how much of that, adapting to bad situations, how much of that comes from Andrei's own experiences living in Soviet era Poland.
Interesting.
Kind of develop, living in this is where you take the fantasy and you're able to apply it to reality.
Yep.
And kind of see where the influences are. And I wonder if that was a major influence. If we had Andrei on the show, we had Mr. Sapkowski on the show, I would love to ask him that question. Is this where the influences came from? Learning how to adapt to a bad situation or a not ideal situation, and being able to thrive and persevere. It's a very quintessential Eastern European attitude and Eastern European way of living life. Constantly being able and needing to adapt to ever changing and worsening situations.
Absolutely.
So yeah, that's really a major theme throughout this book. Now that I think about it, and throughout the book, I'm on the third book now. It's equally the same way. That's more about coexistence. The book is called Blood of Elves, and it's about living in a world peaceably with dwarves and elves and humans, and the dwarves hate the humans, but the elves also hate the humans, but the humans like the dwarf. It's very, very complicated. Well, it deals with ethnocentricity.
Well, as soon as I found out that this, while being the first book, wasn't the first book, the first novel in the series, it kind of got me excited because, there is something very appealing about this world, the world they've created, where I think it would be very easy to create just a straightforward fantasy environment. But I just think the Geralt is a very interesting character to follow, and I just think this concept, one example. So we're talking about the sort of short stories we liked. I think my favorite, or certainly one of my favorite, A Question of Price, which was the short story with Queen, Calanthe, and Prevetta and Dunny, where he is asked to go undercover to a fancy party where the princess is giving her hand in marriage. And I thought some of the sort of quippy wordplay, maybe quippy is generous, but some of the wordplay between the queen and our Witcher character, I just thought it was very fun to read. And it was a very appealing, it felt awfully casual for such a, I would describe, formal world where there seemed to be a lot of rules in place. It did seem like a more modern character in the way it was written. I was worried in some of the earlier stories, I felt it was a little more formal, and by the time we got to this story, it was a little even funny at moments, clever. There were twists, I think, a little bit in this story as well when we're revealed who the monster is in this story. And that's what I really liked was that this book was able to surprise me throughout, and it really made me leaving wanting more from this world. And maybe doing short stories is a good way to do that because it gives you a lot of tastes of a lot of things. But I think it was really successful in that respect.
Yeah. If and they're starting to do this a little bit more in the third book that I'm reading, but you do get a taste of it in the first two books as well, especially in that scene with the meeting the queen. Is that you encounter different different human cultures too.
Mm-hmm.
Like, the culture of Redania is not the culture of the Nilfgaardians, and you have the other people that live in the Skellige Islands that are like basically Celts, like Celtic Vikings, and they have their own culture and attitude and customs, and I like that, and you definitely see that. I mean, it's a lot easier to visualize that in something like a movie or a video game or a TV show, and it's a lot harder than it might seem to capture that in a book, and
Mm-hmm.
I think that Mr. Sapkowski does that very well, and he's able to really differentiate the societies and the worlds, the people of the worlds of this environment, this universe. So
Now, Matt, Wikipedia tells me a fun fact. You may be interested to know this. In 2011, Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk gave U.S. President Barack Obama diplomatic presents, as is custom on his visit to Poland. One of them, a signed copy of The Last Wish.
yeah, I believe he also gave him the video game.
And I bet he plays it all the time.
Well, so the funny thing was he gave him. I remember him giving them the gift basket that had the book, and I think it had The Witcher 3 in it, or if I'm not mistaken. And both of them were signed, and Barack Obama, upon reception of the gift, joked with the ambassador, thank you so much for the gift. Unfortunately, though, I have a Wii.
Aha.
Because, it was only for Xbox, and I think it was for basically everything but Wii. So it was a funny moment from President Obama.
Fantastic.
But yeah, this book, speaking about that gift in particular, this book, Poland sees this book as a like one of its most renowned cultural exports. They've kind of really rallied around this story as kind of their story.
Mm-hmm.
And Sapkowski as one of their greatest modern authors. He's very celebrated in Poland, very respected, and they see this book as kind of sharing their culture with the world. So it's a cultural export for them, and I think that's awesome. I don't think you really see that too much with fantasy novels. I mean, I can't really think of a fantasy novel that accomplished this for a country. Mm-hmm. As like specifically, this is kind of unique that this has done this. So, it's just really neat to see.
Agreed.
One thing I was a little disappointed in: nobody ate pierogies in the book, Sean.
Yeah,
Didn't see
man,
any pierogies being
very
eaten.
devoid of Polish stereotypes. I agree. I agree wholeheartedly. Although I will say, like I said, as I was reading it, it reminded me a lot of the girl with the dragon tattoo. Stay with me. With the respect that it felt like a book that had not been written in English. And as I was trying, because I didn't do any research on the book before I started reading it, other than knowing it was connected to the video game. But I didn't know the country it was from or any of that. And I was reading through it, and I'm like, as I was reading like the types of monsters and the names of them, I'm like, all right, it's European. And I kept trying to like figure out like what. And at first I was like, is it like Scandinavian or like what is it? And eventually I got to Polish. But you can tell reading it. I mean, that you're absolutely right that you can tell it pulls from the sort of the myths and the stories of that sort of that region and of that culture for sure. It's very
Sure.
clear as you're reading it.
Very heavily, it's heavy on the Eastern European influences, which I think is really cool because every other fantasy novel that I've ever read has been very much Western Europe, and the myths and legends of England or France or Scotland, Ireland, like we've read that, Germany,
Yep.
many times, but really Eastern Europe has gone pretty much untouched by this genre, at least in the mainstream. So it was cool to see. The only other book I can think of that kind of gave kudos to the myths and legends of Eastern Europe, and it was not the main focus, but it was definitely very well done, was Neil Gaiman's American Gods.
Mm-hmm.
Another really, really fantastic book. We might have to do that a future book talk on that.
Sure.
But there's definitely discussion at length. A lot of the main themes and main characters are divinities from Eastern European myth. It's cool to see. It's cool to see that area being represented.
Now, Matt, I think we're to the point of the show where I get to ask you this question, which is, I think most people listening probably know of The Witcher from the video game series, the popular video game series. Over 40 million copies sold in the U.S. Immensely popular. Have you played the video game?
I have played the third video game,
which I think is the most famous.
I played
of
The Witcher
the three.
3.
Yeah,
it was definitely the bestseller. It was definitely the gold star child of the series.
Yep.
I don't know if that's fair or not. I can't judge at all because I haven't even seen the first two games played, but I heard they weren't very good, or at least very different from the third one. The third one. What I've seen in the books as opposed to the games is, so the games let you make these decisions that they're very much, can't remember the Faustian. What's the right adjective? Where basically where nothing you do is gonna lead to a good outcome.
Sure.
It's very much like, damned if you do, damned if you don't.
Yeah,
Every decision.
I think that's the bummer principle.
Pretty much, yeah. Very much a catch-22. One of the side quests might involve you going to one of the main side quests involves you go to this baron of this manor.
Yep.
And his son is afflicted with this disease, this like very much like in the book. However, it's your decision, like what to do in that situation. Like you let him live, or do you kill? Turns out if you let him live, like he kills basically everybody on the manor. But if you decide to kill him, the Baron gets depressed and hangs himself. Like it's very much there's no good outcomes to anything. There's another situation where there's an evil spirit that's trapped in a tree,
mm-hmm.
right? And the evil spirit starts speaking to you, and it says, let me out of this tree. I've been cursed to stay here. An evil witch put a curse on me. Let me out. Let me out. I need to leave. I've been in this prison in this tree for hundreds of years. And of course you say, like, I'm a hero. I'm a good person. So I'm going to let this spirit out of the tree, which is pretty much the decision that I think 90% of us would make. So you let it out of the tree, and it goes, I'm going to go take my revenge on everybody. And basically you find out that the witch imprisoned him in the tree because he was an insane, like, bloodthirsty warlord that
awesome
killed a bunch of people. And then his spirit goes crazy and kills a whole bunch of people. It's really very much like very hard decisions. And until you realize, like, no matter what I do, everybody's fucked. And that's the main principle with Witcher 3. It is really cool. I must say, seeing the inverse of what typically happens, because usually with any kind of popular video game, the books are designed to piggyback off of the success of the video game.
Yep.
Halo, Mass Effect, Assassin's Creed, all of the books are written after the game to try to jump on that success and milk that franchise for all it's got. And this is the complete inverse, where we see a video game that is entirely based on the books, and both of them have achieved relative success, I would say. So,
and I am shocked, because if you had handed me the video game and the book, and without any prior knowledge you said which came first, I would have definitely said the video game, because the book reads like a video game. I mean, it reads in a way where you're like, I want to play this guy. Like, I want to participate. Like, this is really neat. And
isn't it? Yeah. It's really just hard to believe that the book came out in 1991 or 92, like very early. Like, you definitely would have believed the game came first, just the way that it's worded. And
it's a total no-brainer. And I've never played the video game. I did go on Steam before the show because I was curious, and they had it on sale for $20, so I bought it, and I'll let you know how that goes.
Okay.
As someone who never plays, so I don't read fantasy books and I never play video games, so this will be fun.
And
I'll report
I'm just warning you, it's a long game.
Yes.
So we'll probably be I'll be asking you, how's Witcher 3 like 10 years from now, and you may not be done with it.
I'll be bored with it long before that.
I've never finished it. I bought it feel like ages ago, and it's a long game, but it's pretty cool. It's fun, and the way that the characters interact is neat to see. I do recommend keep reading the books. The third book is where it starts getting interesting with the storyline. It's definitely a good story arc, and it really goes places. And I'd be curious to see your takes on it, just because I think that you really hit on the high notes. Some things that I didn't even pick up on, like the Queen being very much like a more modern character than everyone else.
I think when we talk about all the short stories in this book, probably my least favorite, or one of my least favorite, was the Striga story. And while I think it had the best action of the book in his sort of confrontation there, what I didn't like was it had some of the stronger traditional fantasy elements to it. The cursed daughter and that weird incest thing that all fantasy books do that I still don't quite understand why that is. It felt so fantasy to me right off the bat, and I made what was my note in here that I thought was really funny? One of my first notes was like, by page 7, I was already confused by people and places. So I didn't think it was a strong start. And then as you get into those later stories, it felt a little more approachable to me. And so I thought that was a big improvement as the book went on. Now, Matt, we're getting to the part of the show where we have to give our final thoughts, and then we use our traditional, I would say patent pending, but it's a scale that's been around forever, judgment scale, unless we want to mix it up this time, of skip it, borrow it, or own it. Would you like to go first, or should I?
I'll go first.
Okay.
I think this book could be a borrow it book. I don't see that. You may not want to read it over and over again. I can't say the same for the other books in the series, though. So far from what I'm reading, I really like the third book, and I would say, go ahead and own it for sure. Because the only way I would say to own this one would be if you were going to read it to your kids or something. But there's some messed up stuff, like you mentioned, the incest and the people getting beheaded and lots of nasty stuff that you probably shouldn't read to your kids.
I'm a 27-year-old man, and I could barely follow the book. I can't imagine a child reading this. So
it'd be great to do the voices. I feel like there's a lot of unique voices.
A kid's version of this book would be good, just not this book.
Yeah. I wonder how that would look. A kid's version. So yeah, I would say I borrow it. What's your thoughts?
Matt, to me, the sort of like 2-sentence synopsis of this book is awesome. Like, I love the core idea of this book. I love the idea of a Witcher. I love the idea of this style of world. I love the idea of even doing it as short stories, I think is really interesting. But I wrote this in my notes as I was reading it, and I'll read it verbatim for you here. Not that it's a long sentence, but it seems like it could have been a home run, but instead he hit a double. And that's what it felt like to me. Like this, and that's why I'm actually, before I knew it switched to a narrative format in a couple books, I was like, I'm not going to read any more of these. Now I kind of want to, because it's like, maybe that's where things really kick into gear and the improvements come in, because this book on its own, I think it's a fine read. I think fans of fantasy will really enjoy it. I would say if you're not generally a fan of fantasy, it's fine to pick up. I judge a book, I was thinking about the books we've read in the book club before, and a book like Devil in the White City or Console Wars, even Ready Player One to some degree, was a book I couldn't put down. It was a book that kept me engaged, and I'm like, what's going to happen next? Ready Player One I read in like one day, because I'm like, this is really, for all the problems it had, it was exciting. This book, it was like, I definitely could put this down. Like, there was nothing about it where I'm like dying to know what happens next. And I think that's just a flaw in its narrative structure, and I think it's kind of just a flaw in the fantasy style, and that's okay. I agree. It's probably a borrow it, more so for fans of fantasy. But I thought it was a good book. I thought it was relatively well written, especially for something translated into English. And I thought it was definitely a solid in my sort of grand rankings of all the books we've done, which maybe I'll keep doing these as we go through and add more to them. But I would say from best to worst, Console Wars, Devil in the White City, probably 1A, 1B, probably my two favorites up there. Probably Devil edges a little bit out. I would say right below that is probably Ready Player One, then The Last Wish, and then like way off the fucking chart into the depths of hell is Of Dice and Men.
Of Dice and Men.
And I think Ready Player One just edges it out for me, because while I think The Last Wish is better written and is more intelligently, is a smarter book, it just wasn't as interesting for me as Ready Player One was.
Sure. I think it also helps that Ready Player One is kind of in a genre all its own, right? I mean,
it's a genre I can connect to. That's where and this is my kind of it is my personal opinion. But for me, I can more relate to. They're both fantasy books in a way, right? Maybe
sure.
More sci-fi, but nonetheless, I can relate to Ready Player One. I can't relate to this book. That's where I struggled.
Gotcha. It's hard to. What I like about fantasy books is that it is very hard to find the relatability at first glance, like skimming the surface.
Totally.
But if you do something like you read really in depth, like the passage that you may very easily have read over the first time, where they talk about how The Witcher is like a job that is kind of ending itself. I mean, you can somehow tie that to, maybe if not your experience, the experience of somebody in this world. I mean, look at I can't think of a good example, but there's got to be examples out there of a job that is kind of designed to eliminate itself. Theoretically, I guess, the first thing that comes to mind is a doctor or something. Like they're supposed to cure diseases, but if they cured all diseases and came up with all the cures, they wouldn't have a purpose anymore.
Yep.
So, then it becomes more practical. Like, do they treat the symptoms rather than cure the disease, because that's more profitable?
But I think those interesting ideas get lost in the short story format. That's the issue, where if there had been a book about, do a prequel, what's Witcher school like? How do you become a Witcher? That could be a really interesting story. I know that the later books are...
they definitely touch on that.
Are Geralt and Yennefer, and they're palling around, and they're doing things like... I wrote towards the end of my notes, I said... this book spends way too much time on everything but the two most interesting characters, Geralt and Yennefer. Like, that is... You lose those themes because you're not featuring these characters. You're featuring a world of stuff.
About Dandelion.
Even
He's a
that, like,
pretty interesting character.
very interesting. He doesn't come in until the second half of the book.
I think
Like,
it's the last. It's probably the. Believe it's the last short story that he tells, and Yennefer too comes in on the last short story.
if I had read only the first third of this book and you had said, Sean, this is the book, I would have chucked it out a window because it was like it was so flat, and then it just got better as the book went on. As you started, it just took that long for the themes to start kicking in and the interesting characters to start kicking in. Like I said, Yennefer doesn't come in until the end of the book, and I don't know. I felt that was a bit of a mess. I think with a little bit of I felt that like this was a book that when they translated it, they really should have had an English author actually not rewrite it, but actually go in and craft it around a little bit. And I think that could have helped it.
I think the translation gets better. I want to say it does.
Well, I'm sure he as an author gets better too. I mean, this was his first book, so
it was.
I got it.
Yeah. So in that way, I like its rawness. So maybe I might change mine from borrow to keep, because I do like the rawness of it, and it's worth keeping just so when you get to the end of the series, you can go back and look at how he's evolved as an author. I think that could for me push it over the edge to keep.
But that's what it is for buy books for me, where it's like, will I ever reread this book? And it just, maybe I would change my mind, but right now
this one, I don't know. I would speed read it again, just to like when I get to the end of the series, just to be like, oh wow, look how much he's changed.
It's an easy. It really is. It did not take me that long to read. I mean, it's really not like I can't imagine with the font's pretty good size, so it's not like it's a super tough read. Yeah,
1 or 2 sittings, like it's a breezy book. Yeah. But by the third book, like he's got the banter down. He's got, there's a lot more humor injected throughout. The characters are definitely more relatable. So I think he really does evolve as an author. This was very much more about establishing the world. But even on that, I think he could have, I think he could have gone more in depth. I don't think you want that, but, I thought he could have gone even more deep with the world. I think he was it felt like he was holding back. And that I wrote that in my notes too. I felt like he was holding back in, really letting this world come to life. A lot of the things, it seems like he ends just a little bit too soon describing certain people or places. So, all I can say is that I'm very much enjoying the third one now. Definitely more so than the first book or the second. But it's an interesting format It's
worth. I would say it's worth reading.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't rush to do it.
I don't
think you have to own it, but it's definitely. I don't think you'll get to the end of it and be like, God, this was a waste of time. Like, no, if anyone was going to say that, it would be me, and I didn't say that. So. I would say this is a successful book club pick, Matt. Congratulations.
Cool. So now I'm 2 for 3?
Yeah, you're 2 for 3, and I am 1 for 1 because I've only ever picked one. So, but which I think might mean the next one's mine, but I have no idea.
Better get started.
What we're gonna read. The problem is, I genuinely, and this book reminded me why I'm not a big fiction guy. I really love. It's funny because before we talked about doing this book, 2 weeks ago, last week, I had started on a nonfiction book already, and as I was reading The Last Wish, I kept being like, I really just want to read my other nonfiction book. Like it's kind of it's bad in that respect, but I'll look into my bookshelf and see what we can pull out. We'll certainly do more of these as time goes on, and like I said, I'm going to try the game as well, and so we'll see. We'll see how that goes. But if anyone out there has suggestions for books you'd like us to read, we would for sure like to hear them. Please let us know. upfordebatetv@gmail.com is our email address, or you can tweet at us at upfordebatetv on Twitter. We have a website, upfordebate.tv. You can go there, get all the past episodes, including the past book club episodes, which are always a lot of fun. Get caught up as you hear us talk about these books. You can also get the video version on YouTube and get the audio version wherever you get podcasts. SoundCloud, Apple Podcasts, Overcast, really anywhere. Just search Up for Debate. And yeah, I think that's just about all the plugs. Matt, anything else you'd like to say before we wrap it up?
No, not really. I think that just about does it over here. I think if I lived in this world, I would want to be just about. I also wrote this in my notes on the bottom. If I lived in this world, I would like to be just about anything but a Witcher.
Yeah, it
Would
is.
not want to be a Witcher.
It's a real. It's kind of like I kind of think of it like animal control is in our
Yeah.
world, where it's like it's a necessary job, but I can't imagine anyone gets excited to be like, oh, we got a rabid raccoon in the dumpster. Call animal control. Like,
You don't think there's? Oh boy,
oh boy, I can't
me
wait to go to
get on
work
my-
today.
let me
More
get on
feral
my
animals.
yeah. Get on my exterminator outfit. Go to town.
Yeah, I can't
Give me
even
my
imagine.
pellet gun.
Nope. But Matt, I don't think we'll leave our career as podcasters to go be witchers. I think we're much more successful doing this.
It pays way too well.
Yeah, exactly. Or really anything at all. So,
Indeed.
indeed. All right. Well, thanks everybody out there for joining us. We appreciate it always. On behalf of Matt, I'm Sean, and we will see you next time for more great discussion here on Up for Debate.